embrace this urgency of creating the beloved community, now is the time to be love. Love means understanding redemptive goodwill toward all which seeks nothing in return. So be love by implementing the demands of justice to eliminate the school to prison pipeline that has so many black children entrapped. Be love by correcting voting policies that seek to suppress the votes of millions of black and brown people. Be love and implement the demands of justice by transforming a society that is disproportionately violent toward black lives, including black transgendered lives and indigenous lives. Be love and correct false narratives and economic policies that continue to divide and pit poor and working class black and white people against each other. Be love and implement demands of justice where systems and structures are deconstructed and lead the way of living in community that reimagines just, humane, equitable, and sustainable policies, practices, and behaviors. Love your enemies. Bless them that curse you. Do good to them who hate you, and pray for them that despitefully use you and abuse you. Be love and do justice and love mercy and walk humbly with our God.
Beloved Community Talk.
Well, welcome to my beloved community, brothers and sisters from across the world, to our beloved community talks. If you have joined us before, welcome back. Tonight is part 2 of the Power of Unlearning. Learning, unlearning as a pathway to individual and cultural transformation. If you were with us last week for not last week, actually 2 weeks ago for part 1, you know that I had the honor of having a conversation with Lady Gaga, who was very transparent about her own journey into coming into the knowledge of her own unconscious biases, especially related to her inability to really speak up and speak out in the face of racial injustice. She revealed to us her process of peeling back the layer and really asking some very critical questions. And confronting herself and doing some very deep work. And so tonight we're going to continue this process because there is another gentleman who has done similar work in another fashion as we talk about the power of learning. He had to unlearn hate. And then we're going to talk to an expert, someone who has done a lot of study and writing around biases, and we're going to look at from whence those biases come. Can we unlearn biases? And what is that process? And so I'm so happy you've joined me tonight, and I do hope that all of these beloved community talks have provided fuel for your ability to bring about individual and be a part of cultural transformation. Now, you know, my father stated that returning hate for hate only multiplies hate, adding deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars. He went on to say that darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. And hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. So if we're going to shift the current tides of bigotry, hate, and bias that divide us in this nation, we must understand how hate is sown in the souls of human beings. We must also understand the vulnerabilities of humanity that lead us to accept generalizations and or stereotypes that lead to both unconscious and conscious biases. The rise of hate crimes and escalating number of hate groups call for each of us to learn our patterns of dangerous discourse dangerous discourse, and learn the patterns of empathy and love that will create and sustain the beloved community. Ultimately, the goal of this beloved community that you hear me so often talk about, and the Beloved Community Talks experience, is to provide a platform for the audience to gain more information and understanding of how the seeds of hate are sown in our language, our actions, and our inactions regarding race and racism, as well as other isms. In addition, the audience, I'm hoping you will gain tools for recognizing, unlearning, and unblocking harmful biased thoughts that hinder our collective quest to create the beloved community. Lastly, and very importantly, this compilation of courageous conversations is purposed to inspire action. In other words, we want you to do more than tune in and listen and hear. We want you to translate what you hear into action. And that's why some of our questions will be purposed in a direction so that you have an idea of what you can do when you leave this conversation. If our world is going to shift right now, when we look at the state, especially of the United States of America right now, there is an onslaught of attacks against our democracy, attacks against learning our true history. There's so much going on in the world around racism, poverty, and militarism. The only way we're going to get there is to have these frank conversations about how did we get to this place where we are treating each other with such inhumanity and with a lack of compassion and understanding, which comes from these biases and these places that we find ourselves, dark places that we find ourselves in when we allow those things to go unchecked and they lead us to that pathway of hate. And so tonight, our first guest knows firsthand about the power of unlearning. Christian Picciolini is an award-winning television producer, public speaker, an author, peace advocate, and a former violent extremist who left the hate movement that he helped create in the 1980s and the 1990s. He began a path of making amends and rebuilding his life, and has also helped hundreds of people leave hate behind. Isn't that something? So he is someone that we all need to hear from. So welcome, Christian. I'm glad to have you with us on today.
Thank you, Dr. King. It's an honor to be here. It's also a privilege to be here. I want to acknowledge my privilege, having been given, a second chance when we still live in a society when people with Black and brown skin aren't even really given a first chance on many occasions. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. Thank you for having me.
So thank you so much. Well, let's just kind of dive in. You have a story that has been told, needs to continue to be told, but more importantly, it's a powerful story of transformation that we need to hear about in this current state of things in our world. We're talking about the power of unlearning. But I believe that as a part of unlearning hate, we have to explore how it is even learned. I don't know if people believe it's learned. I know that people believe it's learned, but there may be some people that believe it's inbred. That's probably a smidgen of people. But let's talk about how it's learned, and specifically, how did you learn hate, and why do you feel that it's effective as a recruitment tool?
Yeah, it was absolutely learned for me. It started for me really in 1987 when I was 14 years old. I was standing in an alley on the south side of Chicago, where I'm from, and I was smoking a joint, and a man with a shaved head and boots came up to me And he pulled a joint from my mouth and he looked me in the eyes and he said, "That's what the communists and the Jews want you to do to keep you docile." If I'm being completely honest, at 14 years old, I didn't know what a communist was. I didn't know if I'd met a Jewish person. I didn't even know what the word docile meant, if I'm being totally honest. But it was the first time in my life that I felt as though somebody had paid attention to me. I want to take a step back and just explain to me what the trajectory was before then. My parents are Italian immigrants who came to the US in the mid-1960s. And when they arrived, they were sometimes the victims of prejudice themselves. So it wasn't something that I learned at home. I learned it outside of the home. And in fact, from the hundreds and maybe thousands of people that I've worked with in the last 20 years to help them disengage from hate, I've also found that it's something that they typically learn outside of the home. For me, my parents were immigrants, so they had to work hard to support the family. They were gone 7 days a week, sometimes 14 hours a day running a small business, and I didn't see them very often. I knew they loved me, and I knew that the aunts and uncles and grandparents that I saw every day who were really raising me on a day-to-day basis loved me. But there was always something inside of me that asked, myself, of course I didn't say it out loud, but I asked myself, why weren't my parents there for me? So I started to blame myself without really having, conversations with my parents. And I started to get very angry and feel abandoned by them. And around 12 or 13 years old, I started to look outside of the home for that sense of community that I was missing at home. Instead of asking for it at home, which they gladly would have given me because they didn't really know the path that I was going down. So I found it in an alley at 14 years old, and the man who walked up to me that day with a shaved head was America's first neo-Nazi skinhead leader. His name was Clark Martel, and he recruited me when I was 14 years old, standing in that alley. And while I can tell everybody at first I didn't know what was really happening, I didn't understand what was happening, I very quickly learned what it was about. It was about hate. And I spent 8 years until I was almost 23 years old as a member of this American hate group, and became a leader eventually, and found my way out only by the grace of the people that I thought I hated. For me, it was really, and it was never, let me just say this, it was never the responsibility of the people who showed me compassion at a time when I really desperately needed it. And these were people of color, people who were Jewish, people who were gay or Asian. They were people who saw in me something that was worth saving. So they, instead of fighting me with, punches and sticks or bricks, they fought me with compassion. And that compassion and that kindness and love that they saw for me, a young neo-Nazi who was violent, somebody who was hateful in his words and in his actions, was the greatest weapon against my hatred. I always say hatred is born of ignorance. Fear is its father and isolation is its mother. I was afraid of what I didn't understand. And I was taught while I was in that space where I found some reward, I found some community, I found some identity, I found some purpose in that hate movement, believe it or not. It was all toxic, but what was able to penetrate through that was the truth of other people that I had kind of stopped myself from seeing for those 8 years. And it was that truth, that compassion, that really was the most powerful weapon to break down my hate. And I owe it to the people who could have been my victims. That they were able to change me, to penetrate me. And I eventually found my way out at 23, and I've spent the last 21 years of my life, after a couple of years of really trying to find myself and doing a lot of self-reflection and soul-searching to try and unlearn what I had learned, I've spent the last 21 years trying to help people disengage, and thankfully I've been able to help hundreds of people leave hate groups behind.
So let's just unpack just a couple of things real quick. I mentioned to you the recruitment tool and why that was effective as a recruitment tool, the hate. But also, how do we address the indoctrination? What are some ways we can stop that indoctrination? Especially for young people, because what I hear is a similar kind of story of those who are in the Black community and the Hispanic community, even in the white community, who end up in gangs. There's similar stories of, some kind of hole, I think you call them potholes, that happens in a person's life. And there's an intersection that occurs that creates this different pathway for them. So let's talk about that. Why is hate an effective recruitment tool? What is it about it that just draws people in? And how can we stop that indoctrination? I know you talked about compassion, but there may be something else there.
No, absolutely. And I think it's really important to remember, and I think this is something that most people don't understand, is most people don't find their way to those hate movements primarily because of the ideology. They're not drawn there initially by the ideology. What happens is, and you were right, thank you for calling them potholes, is while they're on a search for three very important things, and it's something we all search for: a sense of identity, a community, and a purpose. Those things shape who we are. While we're searching for those things in life, sometimes we encounter what I call potholes, and those things are trauma, adverse experiences. For me, it was abandonment. It can be loss, grief, it can be poverty, but it can also be privilege, right? Privilege, if it keeps us too separate from humanity of others, can act as a way to detour us to the fringes where very toxic senses of identity, community, and purpose exist, like white supremacist movement, like gangs, like sometimes drug culture or cults exist, and they're very, very loud, and they're good at promoting a sense of identity, community, and purpose for those who have a void of them. And that's exactly what happened to me. Hate for me was a lot like a shield. It wasn't what was used to draw me in. I wore it to protect myself. I thought I was protecting myself. What really happened, and what I found with the hundreds of people that I've worked with, is it's often not about them hating anybody else. It's about them hating themselves and projecting that onto other people as either self-defense or a weapon, in other words. So I want to be clear. Typically, hate movements, and I know it's hard sometimes to understand because the victims are certainly in that community. But the reason that people hate, I think, is much less about the people that they hate and much more about the fact that they hate themselves.
Wow. So let's talk about this: identity, community, and purpose. This is what all of us are in search of in our life. So how is it that a person, particularly a parent, a close family friend, can pick up that this young person may be being drawn or maybe already into some kind of group like this? In other words, what I heard you say is that you felt a sense of isolation, but your parents were unaware of it. What are the telltale signs? Is there anything that parents can do to ensure that these issues of identity, community, and purpose, that kids are always connected to that and not disconnected from that process?
Yeah, and I think it's something that we've all been taught for generations, about things like if kids get into drugs or if they're getting into a gang, if they change their habits, if they suddenly abandon anything that they love without, really any explanation, if they start to, disconnect from family and people that they've trusted in the past, if their language changes, if their friends suddenly, change all of a sudden, or if they go from no friends to a group of friends that maybe doesn't seem to gel with who they are, all of those things are warning signs, behavioral changes. But I would also argue that, we're living in a time where this isn't just about young people, certainly going into these movements. When we saw January 6th and the hatred behind, the insurrection, those were not young people. Those were people who were CEOs and, were professionals and had their own businesses. And again, you might look at them and say, well, they look like normal people. Why would they be putting themselves in that situation? Well, potholes are really, intimate for people. They're different for everybody, and they're sometimes very difficult to see around all the other packaging that we put around them. So this absolutely is a problem for young people. And as parents, I think we need to listen to young people because they always tell us, they always show us the signs of what's wrong, but sometimes we miss them. And I think we need to, as adults, as teachers, as parents, be cautiously more vulnerable with our children. Because if we can't be vulnerable with them, how will they ever learn to be vulnerable with us and share with us what it is that they're struggling with? We're struggling with a lot as adults too, and I think maybe it's time to start having those conversations within our own families, with our children, even before we start thinking of having them outside with strangers. We have to learn how to be comfortable in our own homes with this as well.
Yeah, I delivered a message years ago called "Deal with It." That if you don't deal with your it, the it will deal with you. And through time, as you don't deal with it, it will show up in all kinds of ways. And so while I agree with you that many of those that were at the Capitol were adults, I would hasten to say that it probably started, though, with those potholes early in their life that were never addressed, never dealt with, and they just kind of lingered through their life. And obviously they found connection points with other people with these same potholes. So what are these potholes that we're talking about? Because everybody's probably saying potholes. What do you mean by potholes? Can we just state what these potholes are?
Yeah. Potholes can be a million different things. They could be trauma, they can be physical trauma, abuse, they can be loss of a loved one, they can be a divorce, they can be job loss, they can be grief, they can be challenges with mental health, they can be poverty, but they can also be privilege. They can be all of the things that we find difficult to navigate around in our lives. And some of us are lucky to have community to help us navigate, or to have resources to help us navigate around those. But some people don't, and it really can help detour people to a place where they find these lottery ticket ideas like hating somebody else or demonizing another group as an excuse to deal with those problems much easier to go towards. So, recruiters are predators, just like, a child predator or something like that. They're looking for vulnerable people who have those potholes so they can insert these narratives of who to blame for those potholes, of who to direct the anger at. And of course, oftentimes it's people of color, communities of color, vulnerable communities that, are demonized by these types of recruiters. So we have to be careful of that, I think, at all ages, all levels, all social classes and education classes, because what we saw in Charlottesville, was not a bunch of tattooed skinheads like I used to be like. It was, polos and khakis and young kids with educations and, middle class or upper middle class, upbringings. While this certainly also occurs in poor white communities, it actually is happening more in middle class and upper middle class communities where that privilege is starting to pull us away from the humanity of each other.
So then, are we talking about unlearning hate, or are we talking about learning how to manage these potholes or address these potholes? Because what I hear you saying is that the hate comes out of that.
Well, I learned how to hate because of the potholes and the pain that it caused me. So I had to learn how to self-reflect, to unlearn that the hate was not about other people. It was really about myself. So it's a lot of learning, a lot of unlearning, and a lot of shifting really our perceptions of how we understand ourselves. So
it's the work of self-love.
It starts there.
It starts there.
Absolutely.
You've said that in your process you sought to make amends. How have you done that, and how important is repentance to unlearning and helping other people unlearn?
Well, it was probably the most important thing that I had to do to understand how to repair the harm that I had caused. After self-reflecting was the first thing that I had to do, because I would not have known how to go out into the world and make amends without doing that first. So I'm grateful for the space that I got as a young man to be able to understand, one, the harm that I'd caused, and two, how to repair that harm. And how I started first was by going into the communities that I had hurt. The communities at my old high school, the communities of color within that. One of the people that actually took the first chance on me was the Black security guard at my high school, who I had a chance encounter with in 1999. And he was a man who I had words with, who, I had caused many problems for by staging sit-ins and recruiting people in my high school. And he was the first person to look at me and say, I see you. I see the child, not the monster. Right. And I had met him again when I was in my 20s, and he had known me when I was in my teen years. And he knew to look past the monster that I was at the broken child that I was, didn't matter what age I had been when I saw him again. And he put his arm around me and he embraced me and he said, you know, this is what you're going to do. You are going to figure out how to fix what you broke. And only you can figure out how to do that. And only you can do that. And I spent years trying to do that by going into the communities that I had hurt and listening, not forcing or prescribing solutions on there, by listening and understanding what it was that I needed to do. And then I started to do it. I started to go into those communities, but I also then very quickly learned that my greatest skill was being able to sit across a table from somebody who was in the same position that I was in, or that used to be. And then I started to figure out that I needed to help other young people disengage from the same hate groups that I was a part of by shedding truth on it.
Wow. So I don't know if anyone may have a question that you want to ask Christian. We have just a few more minutes. If you have a question, if you will just let us know and we will ask that question. Otherwise, we will continue conversing and close out this conversation, because as I said, we have another guest as well. So if there are people who don't believe it's possible to unlearn hate, racism, and bias, what would you say to them? Because, you know, we believe that the work that my father did was about legislative change. It was about structural change, but it was also about heart change, which is the hardest part. You know, all of the structural and legislative, as hard as it is to get us back on track in terms of voting rights, is much harder to deal with the heart of those people who felt the need to do this onslaught of legislation across the nation. Something in their hearts has to continue to be worked on. So what do you say about people who like, forget that hard work? I know it's hard work, but what do you say? Is it possible? I mean, it was possible for you, but do you believe that there's some people that are so entrenched that it is just impossible?
I believe that there are degrees of difficulty, absolutely. And I would say to whoever feels that, one, we should be skeptical of this. Nobody should get a free pass. I do believe that redemption without accountability is just privilege. And I've held myself to that regard, to that standard, and I've held the people that I've worked with to that standard. Part of the unwritten rule that I have with people that I work with is, you know, it's not enough for them to just say they're sorry for what they've done. We have an unwritten contract where they then have to go back into the world and repair the damage that they've caused. And that's different for everybody. I do it in a very public way. For some people, it's not. But I have worked with people for years, and it's something, again, that I've held myself to task for, and something I hold other people for. I would say there are degrees of difficulty. It's not easy to unlearn it. And I think we have to focus on the systemic and institutional change, because we are living in an ecosystem that is breeding racism in white people. And we must change that. But we also have to, like your father said, we have to reach people. And I would just challenge people to find somebody that they think is undeserving of their compassion and find ways to give it to them, and then monitor the change in them, because I think we all will see the change in people. And oftentimes they're the people that we think are most undeserving of that compassion are actually the ones who might benefit the most from ours.
We have a question from David that says, curious to know if you feel like the work to get people to unlearn can be done on a larger scale than the individual.
Well, I think so, but I think, again, it's going to take a lot of systemic and institutional change to do that. We are living in a system that treats people unfairly, that does not promote equity, and it doesn't teach truth. And you know, part of what I've tasked myself to do is to make sure that people that look like me understand what they're complicit with. Because hopefully the goal is, once they understand, that they will turn away from it, that they'll denounce it, and they'll actually take action against that they've been complicit with.
All right. I think that's the question we're going to take for tonight, because that's a very a good question. Helping people, or answer, let's say, helping people to understand what they are complicit with, which I know is very difficult, has degrees of difficulty as well. Thank you for sharing with us. And the most one of the most powerful things that you shared tonight is this whole notion of compassion and the role that it plays in disrupting hate, racism, even bias, and other isms. Our world desperately needs more compassion, but that starts with you first. If you have to learn self-compassion before you can share compassion. So thank you so much for your work. I don't know where we would be without it, and so we appreciate you, and look forward to joining you again on Friday for our Be Love Day, and we'll let everybody know more about that as we close out on tonight. So you can't give it up, but let's give it up for Christian Picciolini
Thank
for
you,
joining
Dr.
us and sharing his journey with us.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you, Dr. King.
Thank you. So he gave us a challenge, you all. That challenge was go out and give compassion to someone who's not deserving of it. That's hard for most of us, because our MO is, as soon as somebody does something that's insulting, that violates, that's hateful, that's ugly, that's evil, our immediate response is either to meet them on the same grounds or to dismiss them. And he told you what interrupted his hate was someone who showed him compassion that he didn't deserve at a time that he felt he didn't deserve it. Now, I would challenge that with Christian, just because of my Christian beliefs, because I think we all deserve to be loved. I not just deserve to be loved, I think we all are supposed to be loved and should be loved. And that's what the world really is in need of more desperately. And I know many people think that's love. What are you talking about? That's love, this little weaky, whammy stuff. We need to give somebody something more than that. And yet Dr. King interrupted time and showed us the power of love to transform systems, to bring about legislative change, and to even transform hearts. Not everybody changed because of my father's leadership, but there were a great number of people who did. And there's power in consistency. So just think about it. That's your assignment from this day forward. Show compassion to someone who you think is not deserving of it, and see what happens. Let's do some interrupting for the rest of our lives. All right, segment 2, we're going to be exploring the origins of bias and the practical steps for unblocking bias. And we have an expert with us on tonight. I hope she forgives me if I mess up her name. But our next guest is going to help us examine biases, where they come from, and how we can unlearn damaging biases. Dr. Pragya Agarwal is a behavioral and data scientist, author, and founder of the research think tank, the 50% Project. Among the books she's written is Sway, Unraveling Unconscious Bias. Dr. Agarwal, who has a PhD from the University of Nottingham in the UK, was a senior academic in leading the UK and US universities for over 15 years, and has worked as a consultant and speaker for numerous universities and organizations, including the United Nations. Let's welcome Dr. Agarwal.
Hello, Dr. King. Such an honor.
Hello. It's such an honor to have you all the way from the UK to join us on today. So let's just dive in here, because there's been a lot of discussion around unconscious biases, implicit bias, explicit bias. Let's just talk about it. What is it? What is unconscious bias? What are biases? And can you share the distinctions between unconscious bias from the conscious or explicit bias? And finally, where do they originate from? How do we get these biases?
So bias, in a sense, the word actually just means to turn or to sway towards something, to prefer something. And we all have these biases because in a way they help us process the information around us in the world, because we can't process all the information in a rational, logical way. So we have these kind of shortcuts in our brain that can help us process the information when it's coming at us really fast. And I can talk about it a little bit more, but what happens is that through our memories and through our experiences, we also make these kind of categories in the world. That's a way of managing the information in the world. We put them into boxes, we label them, and we use these templates to match with any new incoming information. So when we say that all the people who look like this act like this, or they have this characteristic, we're making this generalized assumption about situations and people, and those are stereotypes. And often our biases, our negative biases, are about using these stereotypes to make generalized assumptions about people rather than individuating them, and rather than trying to understand that everybody who looks like something, or who's black or brown, or who has a certain characteristic or certain accent, they don't all act in the same way. They're not the same kind of people. They're not just one homogeneous category. But the fact is that we also have some of these biases are not negative, because I might have preference for a certain kind of ice cream, and I choose it really quickly rather than making a rational decision matching all the attributes of everything when I'm standing in a supermarket or on the beach. But they're not negative. But if that bias, preference towards something, enables me, or it makes me discriminate against something that's not a preferred category, then that creates a discriminatory attitude, which is really harmful in our society.
So then let me ask you this question. Is holding a bias a problem, or is it activating it the problem? Or both? Or the type of bias, holding it?
Yeah, I think holding a bias is harmful, because what we are saying is that we are simplifying the world into some basic categories and stereotypes. And stereotypes are harmful, no matter if they're positive or negative. We're assuming that it's a homogeneous category, it's a label, and nobody wants to be a label. We are all individual people, but those stereotypes can be really harmful. So holding them is harmful, because then we rely on them to process information. Our brains are lazy. We don't want to use our cognitive resources. We use them to divide our world into in-groups and out-groups. We say, this is part of my in-group, so I have preference towards these people. And we know by research that when we do that, we are more discriminatory towards people who are not part of our in-group. And these are the lines we draw. This is the way that discrimination works in our world as well, because we draw these lines and say, these are not the people I know, or I'm familiar with, or I want to know, and these are not my tribe, my community. And that's when it creates problem. But activating of course, is more problematic. We can sometimes hold these biases, but put a gap or a barrier between holding the stereotype and bias and activating it. If we take enough steps to do so, we can stop them from being activated. If we use self-reflection, and if we understand when these biases might be activated.
You use the example of ice cream. I love ice cream. And one of the ones that I love the most is salted caramel. But I like what you said when you said holding them can be harmful, because it's like a continuum. And this is a small example. This is not where it becomes outwardly damaging. But this is, when you have people who are like, well, they don't want to experiment with another flavor because they have such a bias toward the salted caramel. And it helps to exercise that muscle to make us more flexible in considering other things and other perspectives, etc. So I appreciate you sharing that. How do we get in touch with them? What is the best way for people to uncover those biases?
I think we have to understand that where biases come from. So we need to be aware, first of all, acknowledge that we are all biased. And I think we need to come to that place where we acknowledge that by having bias or having unconscious bias, so all biases are not unconscious. Some of them are implicit, which means that we use them without even being aware of that. So if we see a person walking towards us on the road, do I cross the road because I'm suddenly aware of their skin color, or I feel threatened or fearful of them because of certain stereotypes I hold? And I might say I'm actually very fair-minded and egalitarian, but I still have these kind of negative stereotypes of some people, and I still I'm biased towards them. But there are explicit biases in our world as well. And sometimes when we get these kind of messages which embolden us and strengthen our implicit biases, they can become explicit as well. And that is also the danger. We can sometimes hold them, not being aware of them and not wanting to make them explicit. But sometimes we see an environment or the message which tells us it's okay to be explicitly biased, because these are people who are like this, or we need to be biased against them, or these messages embolden us. So I think, first of all, being aware that we all have our biases, and that no matter how fair-minded we are, our experiences, our memories, the way we've been brought up, the books we read, the media we watch, our childhood, our interactions with the world, how much contact we've had with people who are different from us, all those kind of things shape our biases. So we all have biases. Acknowledging that people in this world have different mental models of the world, I think is really useful. That this world is the same, but we all see the world differently. We have different perspectives depending on our context, our priorities. I think that is very important, because that creates an empathetic bond with other people who might have different perspectives on the world. And empathy is a huge thing in terms of reaching out to people who we consider out-group, bridging that gap, and all those kind of things. And I think it's really important that we think about having more contact with people who are not like us. So our affinity bias means that we are more likely to interact with people who are like us, who think like us, not just in real life, but also on social media. We create these echo chambers and these filter bubbles, and we interact with them. And that's how disinformation happens. That's how fake news happens. That's how our biases get strengthened and reinforced. But we need to step out of them, and that's uncomfortable sometimes. So I think being prepared to sit with discomfort is, I think, really, really useful for all of us to challenge our preconceptions as well. And I think the way we bring up our children, I think, is really important, any young people, because if they have a strong sense of self-worth and self-identity, they are less likely to be biased against other people or create very strong in-group associations, which can create prejudice towards out-group. Because what Christian was talking about as well is how these groups or cults, or how these kind of things happen, gangs, is because children are young people are looking for a sense of belonging or identity. And that is done by creating prejudice towards people who are not part of their in-group as well. So I think acknowledging our privileges, I think, is really, really important. But knowing that our individual interpersonal biases often emerge from structural and systemic imbalances in our society as well. Mm-hmm. So these hierarchies exist in our world. We need to teach history more openly and frankly, and talk about it more openly, about what happened. Why are we here today? And we don't talk about it sometimes because of the normative structure in the world, how norms are. We don't talk about the real history. And so we don't know how these power imbalances still exist in this world. And they shape our individual biases as well. And so it's a vicious cycle. Our individual biases strengthen those systemic biases, and we keep going again and again. So I think and I don't believe that a 1-hour training session can really get rid of unconscious bias, So it has to be a consistent work that we are prepared to do, to challenge ourselves and to learn. And unlearning, as you say, is really important because biases are not a latent fixed construct. We know that children learn biases through their life. We learn our biases through our lives. If we learn them, we can unlearn them as well.
So my father said something that was real important, and I want you to shed light on it. He said, I'm convinced that men hate each other because they fear each other. They fear each other because they don't know each other. They don't know each other because they don't communicate with each other. And they don't communicate with each other because they are separated from each other. My question is, how do you feel that fear, separation, and lack of communication are tied into biases?
It's such an important and a poignant quote, really, because yes, a fear, a threat is also the response that really strengthens these biases. A lot of this system one processing that happens in our brain when the biases are activated is in a center of a brain, a part of a brain called the amygdala, which responds to threat and fear. So yes, it's the fear of the outgroup, fear of somebody unfamiliar, fear that is going to come and dismantle our status quo, and change our lifestyle or change our way of life or do something to disrupt how we live and how our society works. I think that fear is always there. Fear of unfamiliar is a very, very strong thing for people, which creates bias and prejudice. But yes, I mean, a lot of that is because, and research shows that is because of the lack of contact and ignorance of people who are different to us, because we tend to stick with people who are similar to us. That's comforting. We look for people who say the same things on social media. We tweet and share and retweet those things which are similar. And so we just create these kind of bubbles for us, which we stick in. And we never venture outside from them. And I think in some communities which are not people are not interacting with each other, these groups can form really strongly, which means that there is a more division between people. And I think that communication is really important, but communication in a non-judgmental way, because we all get very defensive when somebody points a finger and actually you said something which was hurtful. And I talk a lot about microaggressions in workplaces or organizations. That is what happens with microaggressions, because people always think about the intent. Oh, actually, I didn't mean it like that. How could you think that I meant it like that? And I think we need to think about the impact that our words have and our actions have on somebody else, which is actually stepping into someone else's shoes really help. And that is a strategy that's been shown by research, that when people were asked to imagine stepping into somebody else's shoes, they were more empathetic towards them. They could understand their worldview. They had less fear against them. And these lines of communication started happening, and they could understand the impact their words and actions were having on these people. So I think, yes, non-judgmental spaces is really important, where the focus is not on who said it, why they said it, but more on the impact it's having and how we change that, shift that.
Yes, definitely. Non-judgmental spaces. Those are so important for us to address biases, hate. We're talking about change and transformation. Some people call safe spaces. I like non-judgmental better, because sometimes safe sometimes means people they don't want to go through the discomfort, and it is, as you said, these processes can be very uncomfortable. Do you believe? This is similar to a question I asked a Christian earlier, but do you believe it is possible for us to get to a state of being bias-free?
I don't think we can be completely bias-free, but we can get rid of negative, toxic biases. We can move to a place where we are coming at other people's views and perspectives with love. We have, as human beings, we have immense capability of hate, but we have a much larger capacity to love, and I think that is what we have to aspire to. So some of these biases are shortcuts for information processing. So we cannot be rid of them, but we can get to a point where we really don't activate some of our stereotypes, that we stop holding these stereotypes. We start thinking about each person as an individual human being rather than belonging to a particular category or a label, and we start moving towards a world where power is equally distributed. I think that's the goal we need to.
Exactly. Exactly. If you have a question that you would like to ask Dr. Agarwal, please share that with us, and we will get the question answered. I want to ask this question because, you know, with all of the tension that's in our world today, um, um, this process of, number one, us now becoming more aware um, of biases, unconscious biases, having more conversation about, you know, unconscious biases, and more people becoming open to looking at those kinds of things. You know, as well as I, that the process of addressing your biases, unlearning those biases, is not an overnight process. It's not easy. It's a lifelong, I would call it lifelong practice, until you can get to this other way of thinking. My father saw the world as us being a part of a human family and being interconnected and interrelated, and being more concerned about other preservation than self-preservation. And that's a place that most people probably will never totally get to. It's certainly one of my quests. But in this process, you know, how important, as we address from a legal standpoint, legislatively, or from a judicial standpoint, you know, some of the injustices and inequities that exist in society, how is it important that we try to manage, on the other hand, the patience through the process? Because I think there's some people that feel like, you know, we've been going through this for too long now, and you know, my tolerance is low at this point, and frankly, no excuse. But the reality is that people are waking up to a world that they knew not of. I mean, all of us are waking up in different ways. It's shocking to some, you know, it's scary to others. It's, you know, it's new. So talk about this patience process. And then at what point does the patience kind of like wear thin, or has this kind of expiration date, or does it have an expiration date?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, every time we try and change or shift the system, I mean, these systemic biases or imbalances or hierarchies have been entrenched in our society for very, very long time. So it will take a long time for us to move beyond them. Changes happens, but there's a backlash always when something changes. So we know that when we see a Black president, for instance, there was a backlash against it afterwards. There's always a backlash when status quo changes or the norms change, because people fear change, you know, people fear changing the system. So I think we have to be prepared for that, not see it as a negative thing. We need to see it as something that is part of the process. As you say, we need to go through the backlash. We need to go through this discomfort. We need to keep chipping away at it, one drop at a time. Yes, it seems very slow. It seems like, why isn't it happening when we've been talking about it for so long?
Or living it for so long.
Yeah, exactly. Living it for so long. Why isn't it changing? But I think maybe we need to look at what have we been doing wrong in changing it as well? Have we been doing these strategies that we've been using to change it? How do we move past just words to actual action that can mobilize some of these changes as well? How do we go to being actively anti-racist, actively anti-bias? How do we go beyond performativity and just ticking boxes in organizations and in workplaces to actually making change and showing that it is part of our values and not being afraid of the backlash? I think it will happen, but we need to re-examine some of these strategies that we've been using, maybe lately at least, because there's so much noise, there's so many words, and I think it can be overwhelming for some people, even if they have the willingness to change.
So let's share with us some of those strategies, or even those action steps that you share when you're dealing with people in corporate settings or what have you.
Yeah, I think it's really important. I start from a point of creating these kind of non-judgmental spaces, as I was saying before, of discussion where people can talk about it openly, because sometimes silence can breed bias and prejudice as well. Silence can be discomfort as well. So I think talking about it where people can bring their perspectives and try and understand why people have different perspectives as well, and seeing that actually these little actions and words, seemingly minor actions and words, can have huge psychological impacts as well. So in creating more interaction between people, chipping away these echo chambers and bubbles that are created, these groups, in groups and out groups that are created, in these cliques that are created in workplaces, because that can also reinforce that. And I think language is really important, because language is a reflection of society, but also a lens on society as well. So the way we use language and words is really important as well, because that can hurt, because that can reinforce biases, that can show our biases as well. So I think those are some of the things that we can do: reflect on our biases, but reflect on our privileges as well. How can we use our privileges as an opportunity, not as something to induce guilt in us? All of us have privileges. It's not just about some people having more. Yes, we have different kinds of privileges. So I think, how do we use that to support those who don't have a voice, we can actively stand with them and say, actually, I support this movement, I support inclusivity, I support getting rid of biases. And I think organizations have to look at individual and interpersonal biases, but also institutional change has to happen at the same time. It's not one or the other, no. So we need to look at systemic and institutional changes as well, and policies, along with individual and interpersonal unlearning. So it's a huge process that has to happen, but we have to do the work. We have to be uncomfortable. We have to sit with this discomfort. We have to do it consistently and regularly, and just keep doing it, I think.
Where are you on your journey?
I am in the journey.
I understand. Me too.
Yes. I have had a lot of time to reflect on it, on my internalized beliefs as well, I think, because we grow up and we internalize these beliefs about ourselves and about our place in society. While writing the book, my book, it was a really, really reflective process for me, because it made me aware of so many of the things that of I do as well, and the biases that I hold, the stereotypes that I hold. And that's why I came at it from a very non-judgmental way, because saying that I am biased and so are you.
Right,
we need to just do this work together.
Right. So, wow, this has been great tonight. One of the things that both you and Christian talked about is self-reflection. And I don't think we do enough of that in our world. And ironically, we were all interrupted and disrupted by a pandemic that slowed us down. And I'm always concerned that during that time period, did we really take advantage of kind of reflecting on the things that we needed to do differently? You know, everybody started talking about a new norm and trying to rush to it. But really that new norm was about looking in the mirror and looking at the ways in which, you know, we have to continue or to be on. Some people continue, other people to start on the journey of peeling back these layers of biases, because at the end of the day, personally, I feel that it is the reason why we have so much injustice and inequity in our world. You know, so thank you so much for the work that you are doing. You know, I continue to wish you the best and look forward to intersecting with you again at some point. I will continue on my journey as you continue on your journey, and we will make this world, as my father would say, make of this old world a new world where we can live with justice and equity and humanity and peace.
Absolutely.
So thank you so
Thank
much.
you so much for having me. It's been very
Yes.
emotional and such a pleasure to speak with you.
And then thank you for sharing with us. I know there's a big time difference, so I appreciate you taking your time out today. I won't say it's a night where you are. It's
Yeah,
is
it's
it early in
midnight.
the morning? It's midnight. It's okay. So thank you so much, Dr. Agarwal, and thank you all for joining us tonight. Wow, I feel like just self-reflecting right now. I don't know about you. That's probably one of the most difficult things that most of us can do, which is to look in a mirror and look at yourself, look at your thoughts, your beliefs, your ideologies, your biases, and how they are expressing themselves, showing up in your world, and how they are contributing to the state of affairs that we are currently in. We've got to unravel all of this. We've got to unlearn, and that unlearning, as we saw from Lady Gaga to Christian to Dr. Agarwal, self-reflection is one of the most important things we can do. So slow down. Don't be so much in a rush to get wherever you're trying to go, because the most important thing is that you solidify, your own identity and purpose and self-love so that you can be a vessel in this world for love, for unconditional love. And so I want to thank you for joining us tonight on this journey of unlearning. And I encourage you to continue to look at the ways in which you need to unlearn some things and learn about other people. Let's try to come out of our comfort zones and intersect with people in other comfort zones. Let's give up our right to be right sometimes, just to go and hear other people and their perspectives. You don't have to agree with them. You just need to connect with them. It's something about connection that can change our need to feel so ingrained in our thinking. You don't have to change your value system. You don't have to compromise your principles, but you can learn to understand and appreciate other people and look for the point of intersection, because sometimes there are those holes that Christian talked about, that if we listen long enough, we will discover them, and we will help people see those holes, and then help them to join our journey of unlearning, so that we can learn, as my father said, to live together as brothers and sisters, so that together we will not be forced to perish as fools. We would love to invite you to share with us your feedback on tonight's Beloved Community Talk. I think this is the first time that we are doing this. Please use the link on the crawl, or hold your phone up to the QR code on the screen to complete a short survey to let us know if these conversations are indeed helping us build the beloved community, if they're moving the needle. We need to hear from you. This is our way of knowing what we need to adjust to meet you where you are, so that we can continue our journey on creating the beloved community. So we have to disrupt and interrupt the norm to create a new norm going forward called be love. Say that to yourself. My new norm is to be love. That's my new norm. Be love. Be love, Bernice. Back it up. You're getting ready to be hate. You're getting ready to be mean. You're getting ready to be insulting. You're getting ready to be humiliating. You're getting ready to be violent. Be love, Bernice, in this moment. Yes, you can still speak truth to power. Dr. King certainly did not mince his words. Well, I hate to depart you, on tonight or today or this morning, wherever you are in the world. But I want to again remind you that a great nation is a compassionate nation. And so go out and be compassionate to those who may be undeserving. And let's start a revolution of love and transformation in this world that would lead us to a just, humane, equitable, and peaceful world. Please have a good day, a good evening, a good night, or good morning, wherever you are in the world. And always be safe.